football junkies? Dan DeSetto back with the DPS All Football Talk. Spring wrap up. So we are June 21st, first day of summer. Today is the 25th. So a couple days are getting shorter now. And we are 59 days away from the kickoff of week 0. So for junkies like myself who wait all year for football season, it's not too much further. So what I wanted to do today is document some of the things that happened during the spring, go over some of that stuff that, maybe some of you haven't been paying attention to because you've got a life. You don't need to do football 24/7. You're not semi-retired like I am and have time to watch gobs and gobs of podcast content. So, let's just do a quick wrap up here for you folks that might not be aware of how things have been progressing this spring. So we just turned the clock to summer, as I mentioned, and we have got the books are out, the magazines. Phil Steele's preview magazine is sort of like the kickoff of football season, like the unofficial kickoff of football season. The Athlon magazine, the other ones that are out there, Lindy's and Street and Smith's and whoever else is out there. All those magazines are out. The ESPN FBI have been updated. The S&P Plus, SP Plus rankings have been updated. The K Ford has done his thing, got his updates out there, and with all their predictions to the best of their knowledge, and predicting what teams are going to look like this year, based on the changes that they had since the NFL draft of last spring. So teams lost a lot of players in the draft, new coaching changes, new coordinators possibly, new recruits coming in, 5 stars, 4 stars, 3 stars, no stars, whatever, all coming in and starting early spring practice and things like that. And, we're off and running for the season. So let's get started talking about sort of a quick spring wrap up. So first things first, no huge major like the off season between the 2023 season when Michigan won the title and the 2024 season was a huge transitional year for college football. We had our first 12-team playoff. We had a lot of people complaining about the way the seeding was going to go for that playoff. We had super conferences starting where we had, teams like UCLA, USC, Washington, joining the Big Ten. Oregon, of course. We had Arizona State and Arizona joining the Big 12, along with Utah. And so a lot of transition that year. We had Cal and Stanford joining the ACC. You had Texas and Oklahoma joining the SEC. So we had these new super conferences. And that off season last year was a whole lot different than this off season. There was a whole lot more, just tons of things going on. This has been a much quieter off season by comparison. But there were a few stories. We kind of kicked it off with a change to the playoff, the 12-team playoff that's going to happen this year. We kind of kicked it off with a little change there. They changed it. So many people complained about teams that were lesser ranked, like Boise State and Arizona State, getting automatic buys. I've said my piece about that. I think there's no problem with that as long as you reseed after the first round. But they prevailed. I'll quickly say the drawback to that is now your SEC championship and your Big Ten championship really have no impact about anything. And I think the ratings of those games will suffer as a consequence. When Georgia plays Texas in 2024, after the 2024 season, Texas's loss meant that they had to play an extra game in the playoffs. But losing that game means they had to play an extra game in the playoffs that they wouldn't have had to play otherwise. Georgia got to go on to the next round, to the second round, and got a bye through the first round. So, Texas did get a home game, but they still had to play an extra game because they lost that first round. Same for Penn State. They had to play an extra game against SMU on their home field because they lost to Oregon. I don't know. I just don't think it's wise to take away your two breadwinners, the Big Ten championship and the SEC championship, the meaning of those games. So if you're going to get rid of those games, that's fine. But if you're not going to get rid of those games, you got to have a penalty for losing them, or else the game is completely meaningless. And to me, I worry about guys will simply sit out those games because there is no benefit at all to winning or losing those games. You might as well wait until the playoffs. So this year, that 12-team playoff is going to have straight seeding, and most likely the loser of the SEC championship and the loser of the Big Ten championship are going to get a bye in the first round of the playoffs, and I don't like that at all. Don't like it. Never will like it. 12 teams was the right answer, and we'll talk about the changes that are being proposed upcoming, but I don't want to focus too much on the playoff. There was other news as well. I think one of the early things that happened, and I don't know exactly the timeline of when it happened, but Texas Tech, big donor for Texas Tech, Cody Campbell, $4.08 billion. He sold his oil and gas company. He's a Texas Tech graduate and gave a huge donation to the Texas Tech athletic program. And lo and behold, they started buying recruits with that money. And a lot of people are expecting big increases for Texas Tech coming up because of this new influx of capital. So that was one thing that happened in the spring. Probably the biggest thing that happened in the spring was Nico Iamaleava, the former quarterback of Tennessee Volunteers. Got Tennessee to the playoffs last year. They didn't do very well once they got there, but Nico was basically cut. He was like the first instance of a player being cut from a team, from a college football team. He got cut by Tennessee for holding out and demanding more money. They cut him loose, and he wound up at UCLA. Nico Iamaleava wound up at UCLA, and he'll compete for the starting job over at UCLA, and he was replaced by transfer Joey Aguilar from Appalachian State. So yet to be seen. It had about a one-game impact on the over-under for Tennessee. They dropped by approximately one game, maybe 1.5, in people's assessment for where they're going to be. So, was it worth it for Tennessee to hold out for that? We will see. We'll see who wins that battle going forward. But that was big news, sort of another thing that signaled the beginning, of the end for the old ways of doing things in college football. Now that there's no bagman situation anymore, now it's it's out in the open. You're paying players, etc. And we got the NIL deals and the this and that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that also coming up here in just a second. Um, so another thing that happened in the spring that kind of was noteworthy was a couple of key injury news. So every year, the spring games, we wind up, spring training and spring practice and early summer practice, we start to get some injuries. And the biggest notable injury came out of Oregon. Their superstar receiver, Evan Stewart, is out for the season, out for the 2025 season with a knee injury. So um, he was the biggest injury news and kind of so far the only one that we've seen that was based on off-season workouts. Uh, Speaking of spring games, it was kind of a first of its kind year for the spring games as well, as coaches took the cue from a few other coaches in 2024 who decided not to do spring games per se, so that their competition could not scout their players and pilfer their lineup. So it was really a bummer for fans. You could still go to the game, you could still watch the game, but a lot of them were not televised. Usually, it's a big televised event, in the spring games for all the different teams, and many of them were not televised this year because coaches did not want to show off their players for the national audience. Uh, some some guys like Bill Belichick, who's that was his first spring as head coach of the North Carolina Tar Heels. He didn't even put numbers on his players for the spring workouts. So it turned out to be, it's kind of a sad thing for fans to see those spring game weekends, those late March, early April when the weather turns nice after the winter and everybody wants to see some football who can't make it to a game, can't make it out to a game, a spring game themselves, seeing that sort of tradition, that spring game tradition, kind of go by the wayside. So this is the first year we had that happen. And again, Evan Stewart was one of the casualties of the spring workouts, but not in a spring game per se. Another notable injury that we want to talk about is DJ Lagway, Florida's quarterback. So most of us remember that Florida took a big step up last year, started out really rocky last year. Looked like it was going to be a really tough year for the Gators, but then all of a sudden Lagway comes back, DJ Lagway, and they start really playing well after October time frame. Lagway got hurt, and there is news that his shoulder may not be better in time for the season. There's some concerns about that, so that's a spring piece of news that was being talked about a lot. So that we got to keep an eye on the DJ Lagway and the Florida Gators. Their prospects may count on how well Lagway is able to recover, and will he be back in time for the season. So that was some more news out of the spring. We kind of had the SEC media days in the spring, we had all the conferences had media days, but the one that got the most attention was the SEC meetings, and there was a lot of talk about strength of schedule, and the playoff committees should take in schedule strength into account more than they do now, et cetera, et cetera. And there were some proposals for the 2026 playoffs being thrown around. Most notably, the ones that seem to be crystallizing are one of two options. It looks very likely that we're going to go. We started thinking we were going to be at a 14-team playoff. I think it looks likely we're going to bounce over 14 teams for 2026 and go to 16 teams for 2026. Again, I don't like it. I think 12 is the right number, and I'll tell you why in a little bit here. But the proposal sort of hit an impasse when there was a disagreement between the two big players, which is the Big Ten and the SEC. Big Ten is, thinking they don't want the proposed 5 automatic qualifiers, which is the 4 Power 4 conference champions and the 1 group of 5 champion and 11 wild cards. They want the other proposal, which was a 4 plus 4 plus 2 plus 2 plus 1 plus whatever, plus 3, I guess that is. So it would be 4 automatic qualifiers from the SEC, 4 automatic qualifiers from the Big Ten, 2 from the ACC, 2 from the Big 12, 1 group of 5 champion, 3 wild cards, which Notre Dame would take one of those if they met certain criteria. So that was the proposal that the Big Ten was more in favor of, and for a time there, the Big 12 as well. The Big 12 and the ACC have since backed away from their agreement with that proposal because it is like, even though it may be the best thing for their conference to actually be guaranteed to get 2 spots in the playoffs instead of what might happen with a 5 plus 11 model, which is 5 automatic bids plus 11 wild cards. The SEC, ACC, and the Big 12 are rightfully backing away from the other model because it basically puts on paper that you are a subordinate conference to the Big Ten and the SEC, even though in football, the stats have shown that they kind of are in most years. In some years, maybe not. So, that is a difficult thing for the ACC and the Big 12 because it doesn't just affect the playoffs. It affects recruiting. It affects advertising. It affects what coaches are going to come to your schools. If you're, admitting on paper that you're a lesser conference than the other Power 4 conferences, that makes it a difficult battle. And what we have already started seeing is those 2 conferences' qualities are beginning to degrade because of the changes that have happened in college football. So I don't want to spend any more time than that on it. I don't like going past 12. I wish we would just stick with 12, keep that going for many more years later, and just change, a couple of key things about the 12-team playoff, and you'd have a really good thing. But the conferences want to guarantee inclusion. Then a couple weeks later, there was a House settlement. The biggest thing that came out of the House settlement, so the big lawsuit, NIL lawsuit, etc., was settled in the House, and they created a new oversight group for NIL spending. One of the outcomes of this settlement was a new oversight group that's going to look at the NIL spending and look at every contract that gets signed for an NIL to determine whether it is fair market value or if it is just trying to hide something, basically pay for play, kind of hide something. So that decision came down, the impacts of which are not going to be seen right away, but in the future of the sport. The college football, the odds to win the national championship came out, and the over-unders for every team in every conference came out. We're going to go over those in just a second. But as far as the national champion odds are concerned, all the big players have questions. So it's what makes it an interesting year coming up in 2025. Ohio State, the national champs, lost a ton in the draft. I mean, an absolute ton. Lost their quarterback, got a brand new quarterback playing who's never taken a snap. So Texas lost a ton in the draft. They have Arch Manning coming in, who's got limited experience with a couple of starts last year, but very limited. UTSA is not going to be of the quality that he's going to see when Mississippi State and UTSA are not going to be of the quality of when he has to face an Oklahoma defense or an LSU defense or an Alabama defense or whatever. So we will see what happens there. Alabama also has questions. Of course, losing Jalen Milroe. So new era there, and a lot of people, are unsure about what's going to happen with Alabama. So the teams with the least questions seem to be bubbling to the top of the experts lists for, who's going to be good this year. So as the spring progressed, you started to see Penn State show up in a lot of people's minds. Why? Because they return a pretty good quarterback. Drew Aller had pretty good success with a few glitches in the big games. He had a few glitches in the big games, costly glitches in the big games. And you could say the same thing for Cade Klubnik, who in field goal range threw an interception that cost Clemson the South Carolina game last year, but played well against Texas, bringing Clemson back against Texas when they looked like they were going to get run out of the building. So, the big players have a lot of questions, and that makes for an interesting year. Are they going to dominate? Is there going to be a dominant team like we've seen, for a few years, many years running, right? So are there going to be dominant teams? Revenue sharing, the NIL, that sort of thing, transfer portal has taken away teams' ability, the big players' ability to stockpile depth, and that is showing up in the data. If you lose starters, you don't have five stars backups anymore sitting on the bench waiting their turn in most cases. So teams with with experience and finished well last year are the ones that are favorites. So kind of Notre Dame, Penn State, Clemson. We're seeing Clemson on a lot of lists. I'm about the only one who's kind of down on whether Clemson really has a shot. I understand their offense could be good enough to carry the team a long way this year. But that defense was really, really bad last year. I mean, really bad. Statistically, the worst defense since the pre-Venables days, which was 2012. So they got a long way to go on defense with Tom Allen as their new coordinator. They got to turn that defense around quick. You don't have to have a dominant defense to win the championship, but you got to have one that's in the top 20. You got to have a top 20 defense, and they were a long way from a top 20 defense last year. So that is the question on Clemson. A lot of people, I've seen him as high as number one on some very, well-respected podcasts. A lot of people are very high on Clemson. And the reason is obvious. When you do the analytics, offense trumps defense, in the statistics that are important, right? The statistics that are important to win championships. Offense, you gotta score with the football. You've got to be able to run the football. You got to be able to throw the football. And defense, not quite as important. However, you do have to have rushing defense. And Clemson, that is exactly where Clemson had an issue last year. Their rushing defense was staggeringly bad by their standards. 8 games last year. In eight games last year, they gave up 149 yards or more in 8 games last year. And you know how many California had? The new ACC player, California, had none. Clemson had 8 games of giving up over 150 yards. Clemson missed 15 tackles against Lenore Sellers when he basically did a one-man show and beat Clemson last year. The rushing defense has got to get better because it's one of the critical stats for winning the championship. Okay, here it is. Found it. Okay, this is the playoff odds. So these are the only teams who are favored to make the playoffs this year. That means the juice is negative on the make the playoffs. The juice is positive on the miss the playoff odds. The only ones who have positive money on missing the playoffs. So Ohio State, pretty much a lock to make the playoffs because the no plus 240, they're going to give you $240 if you lay down 100 on Ohio State to miss the playoffs. So they're pretty confident that they're not going to be giving you any money there. Same with Oregon and Georgia. They think they're pretty much a lock, even up to Penn State, pretty much a lock to make the playoffs, plus 176 for Penn State. Then you start to get a little bit iffy where you could maybe take a flyer on Notre Dame, Alabama, Clemson, right? Maybe one of those teams doesn't make the playoffs. I think Clemson's miss the playoff scenario would mean that they either beat LSU, they lose to LSU, they beat South Carolina. So it's a battle between their over under win total, which is 9.5, and whether they'll make the playoffs or not. Because if they're 9-3, they're going to have to win the conference to make the playoffs, as we saw last year. If they're 9-3, they most likely lost their out of conference games to the SEC, which would still give them an opportunity to play for the ACC championship most of all, right? And they could make the playoffs that way. So 8-4 or basically beating both SEC teams but losing a bunch of games to a bunch of toss-up games in the ACC and missing the ACC championship game would be the path to lose, because Clemson has that tough schedule. They got LSU at the beginning, and they got an improved South Carolina team now. Now that South Carolina's gained respect, they actually, it helps their schedule. So if they split with those teams, or if they beat both of those teams but lose a bunch of games in the ACC and miss the ACC championship game, they may even get in the playoffs that way, right? But, as a wild card team, because they have a win against LSU. What if LSU, so that the scenario would be LSU has a terrible year, South Carolina has a terrible year, Clemson beats them both, they both have terrible years, and then Clemson loses a bunch of games in the ACC and misses the ACC championship, then they would miss the playoffs. So you have to decide which one you like best, the 9.5 over under or the miss the playoff on Clemson. It's an interesting thought exercise, right? So that's that. Speaking of over unders, let's talk about those. Here are the over unders for the ACC taken today, September. Not September yet, June 25th, 2025. Obviously, these numbers change often, and they will change all the way up to week 1 when they actually lock them down. Right now, 9.5 for Clemson. We talked about that scenario, right? They got 2 SEC teams on their out-of-conference schedule. They've got some toss-up games. This year, they play Georgia Tech, which they did not play last year. And Georgia Tech is highly regarded by a lot of experts. 7.5 and juiced heavily to the over. So people are high on Georgia Tech. So that's a game. They play SMU. That's an 8.5 over under juiced to the over. So they play North Carolina. Who knows what you get with Bill Belichick when you play them? They play FSU. They play Duke. So Clemson doesn't have an easy road this year. Their schedule was a little bit easier last year than it turns out to be, even though they had Georgia and a really good South Carolina team on their schedule last year. This year's ACC schedule, I think, is tougher than last year's. Miami is juicing under right now at 9.5. So big year for Mario Cristobal and Miami. Carson Beck in as quarterback. Can Miami actually get the job done this year? We've been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for Carson Beck. For Miami to actually get back to the ACC championship and win it. They've been to it a couple times, but in the 25 years they've been in the, or 20-something years, 23 years, or whatever it's been, they've been in the ACC. They have not tasted an ACC championship yet. So is this the year finally they do it? And then you can read the rest down there, all the way down to Stanford and Wake Forest at the bottom there. So big drop for Syracuse, as 10 win team last year, down to 5.5 this year. So that's the ACC. The Big Ten, Oregon right now is the betting favorite for as far as win totals go, 10.5, under juiced slightly to minus 122. Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, that's a pretty good top of your conference right there. Michigan not far behind. I think people are pretty high on Bryce Underwood and Michigan making a run this year. Illinois is the enigma statistically, right? So Illinois finished, as we talked about Ole Miss being one of the underachieving teams last year. We talked a lot about Ole Miss. Was always, and you said Ole Miss underachieved their statistics. Illinois was the biggest overachiever of their statistics last year. They were not a great football team statistically. They were a Tier 4 football team most of the year, Tier 5 in some cases. They didn't rank highly in anything. They weren't great at running the football. They weren't great at throwing the football. They weren't great at stopping the run. They weren't great at stopping the pass. They just won football games because, they know how to win football games. And ultimately that's what it's about. It's not about how statistically great you are. It's about how you win football games when it matters. So Illinois, be very interesting to see where they land this year. Are they due for a fallback? Indiana, expecting 8.5 is a pretty big drop from where they had 11 wins last year in the regular season. Expecting a drop off down to 8.5. Big year for Nebraska and USC, right? 7.5, both juiced over. Nebraska juiced slightly more over than USC. Nebraska needs to break that top 25 streak. They haven't beaten a top 25 team in, I think it's this decade. I don't know. It's been a long, long time. USC, big year for Lincoln Riley. Can he get the Trojans to, up into that upper echelon of the conference? We haven't seen them there in a while. Good year for Washington in their first year in the Big Ten, and they'll be a sneaky team. They're juiced to the under, though, at 7.5. And you can see the rest down there. Rutgers, they don't have an over-under number on Rutgers, so I don't know what the story is there. Minnesota had them 6.5, but it went away last time I checked, so I'm not sure what's going on with Minnesota. PJ and the boys there with Minnesota. So that's the Big Ten. Here's the Big 12, and recent development, Texas Tech has kind of taken over on the over-under front. So it isn't always about your strength of your team, your power ranking. It's also your schedule. And Texas Tech, 8.5. But you can see here that up from Texas Tech all the way down to West Virginia, only 3-game spread for the Big 12. Everybody's a good team. Everybody's a decent team. Nobody's a great team, apparently. According to the odds makers, nobody's a great team. Everybody's a really good team. So total chaos. Once again, it's going to be the most fun conference out there. Of note, Colorado, 6.5. They were a 10-win team last year, or 9 or 10. I can't remember if it was 9 or 10 regular season games. They're down to 6.5 this year and juiced heavily to the under. So after losing Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter off of that team. So yeah, interesting. This is just a great and interesting conference in terms of the conference battle. I may be watching this more Big 12 games than anybody else this year. Personally, I just think this conference is really fun. So we'll see what happens here. Oklahoma State, you remember, used to be a very, at times with Mike Gundy, used to be a very good team, and they really dropped off last year. So can Arizona State repeat what they did last year without that powerful running back? So they return Sam Leavitt, one of the top 2 rated quarterbacks in college football right now. And then the SEC, 9.5 down to 3.5 for Mississippi State. Interesting that, their top end is not as highly rated as far as win totals as the Big Tens. There's 3 10.5s, remember, for the Big Ten, 3 9.5s for the SEC. Kind of a nod to their strength of schedule, having, a deeper middle tier, I guess you would say. South Carolina all the way down to 10th this year at 7.5 wins, with all the losses that they had. So anyways, that's my spring wrap up. Kind of all I wanted to talk about. Let me look at my notes real quick, make sure I covered everything. We talked about in a previous podcast, we talked about the FBI came out and what their expectations were. K4's out, all the magazines are out. So go get those magazines, find out what Phil Steele thinks about your team, and compare it to these numbers here that you see. We are 59 days away from kickoff. Can't wait. We may do one more preseason broadcast, and then we'll start into the week on the Tuesday of week 0. We will start our plays for the year. So our DPS plays will come out on week 0 and roll all the way through the season, hopefully, and looking for better results than we had last year. But we've been studying it hard, and we'll see what we can come up with. This has been the DPS All Football Talk podcast. We appreciate you. If you could subscribe. I don't have any subscribers on this channel yet. I've moved over to this new channel, lost all my subscriptions, and I need everybody to come back and start subscribing so that I can eventually do live someday, maybe do some live feeds with chat and all that kind of stuff that makes it a lot more interesting. So thank you all for watching. Thanks for subscribing, liking if possible. We will see you next time. Dan DeSoto for the DPS All Football Talk broadcast. See you next time.